You're listening to the Digital Deep Dive, where we tackle the newest trends, strategies, and pain points shaping growth across the digital landscape. From Amazon and D2C to international expansion, join our host and e-commerce leaders across multiple industries for in-depth discussions on how to maximize your brands in the digital arena. Now, here's your host, Aaron Conant.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Digital Deep Dive podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Conant, and today, some old friends we're bringing on, Oskar and Chris from First Mover. Known them for a long time, pretty much since the time I kicked off, eCom advisory back in the day, which is now BWG Connect. Overall, just leaders in the space. And one of the coolest things that they are doing in this space is I'm really big on education, informational networking sessions that are free to brands and organizations as a whole. And they're doing something very similar, very cool in this space. And they've just been great friends. So Chris and I were connecting a few weeks back and said, hey, it'd be great to have you on. And he agreed. So Chris, Oskar, thanks so much. I'll kick it over to you, Chris. If you want to do a brief intro on yourself and First Mover, that would be cool. And then we can get to Oskar and a little background, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Sound good?
Sounds great. No, we're so excited to be here, Aaron. Thank you so much. Again, for anybody who doesn't know my infamy as a geek in this space, my name is Chris Perry. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at First Mover, a co-founder. We'll kind of share, we geek out today on what First Mover does and areas that we're trying to help everyone win in this space. But prior to co-founding First Mover, I led e-commerce across 3 different CPGs, Reckitt, Wellness Pet Company, and Kellogg's more recently, and then got to work with a ton of other wonderful brands at Edge by Essential, where I led executive education there, really finding my passion for education, which is a big part of what First Mover does, both publicly through custom trainings and other advisory services we do provide to different companies in this space. But I couldn't do anything without my partner in crime, Oskar Kaszubski.
Hey guys, I'm Oskar Kaszubski, originally from Poland, 20 years in digital and e-commerce. I actually led e-commerce for Kimberly-Clark, Mondelez, and Kellogg's, so tons of experience as a practitioner. I'm a chief growth officer at First Mover, really doing a lot of the work on advisory. But truly what we are is we are a think tank just trying to come up with some new ways of actually looking at old problems and solving also the future problems. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I want to kick it off because, a lot of times we're talking, there's new tech or new strategies or pain points. But in this case, what's come up a lot, and I think it's going to come up more over the course of this year, is change management in this space. And people, and I was having a great conversation with somebody at your old company, Chris, over at Reckitt. And she just said this awesome comment that a lot of times people are throwing tech at people problems. And you can't always solve those. Some cases you can. But in a lot of cases you can't. And there's a lot of organizations right now trying to figure out, as the pendulum swings back and forth, we're just, how do we structure an e-com team? How do we have flow? What does an organization do? And I know you guys are doing a ton in this space. We'd love to hear, thoughts across the board. What are you guys seeing on a daily basis? And what should people be thinking about when it comes to change management in this space?
Oskar, I want to tee it up to you in a second because I know this digs right into your I don't want to call it the black hole you're in because it's an exciting it's a swirl out there. It's a new galaxy of opportunity. But last year we were facing that same challenge. We were doing a lot of these things with different companies. We were facing this. There was this clear imperative of winning in e-commerce as a leading indicator to winning in commerce. And we've obviously been in the space for a long time, but to be fair, not everyone has been in this space. And it was COVID that really accelerated everything. So I'm giving people a break. It wasn't the majority of all sales yet for many categories and many companies. But as it was becoming clear that this was important, we were still seeing a lot of companies I don't want to say dragging their feet, but their teams in e-commerce or omni were leading. But it was I always like to say it was like a dog in a yard with an invisible fence. I could go up to a point, but I couldn't go beyond the fence because I had to bring the company along with me. And so we really were trying to figure out, well, okay, so what are the pillars of change without trying to go overly academic and theoretical? What are the pillars of change that really drive effective change, whether it be e-commerce or the metaverse or whatever comes next, right? And so last year we put together this ebook, which you can get on our website, and it's free. It's called Sheared, and you'll notice it because it's this lovely lime green background with a sheep cartoon on it. But it wasn't meant to be hokey. It was just to point out this analogy of everyone is in this herd behind this fence that is kind of made up. Like we can't get over the fence, but there really is no fence. It's a proverbial fence, and we need to like break from the herd, and we can hop the fence of change adoption by employing and measuring our organizations against kind of 8 pillars, and all of the things you were just saying, Aaron, whether it's capabilities and tech, obviously resourcing and investment, the actual strategy, the structure, the people, the education, the measurement, all these things play into that. And there's both kind of a qual and a quant way to like assess yourselves. We're actually relaunching a sequel to that, Sheared 2, at the end of this month, both a playbook and a discussion about the progress that's being made that we see, because a lot has, but with all the disruption to come, it's not enough. We have a lot more to do for companies to both survive, but ideally thrive. And so, but a big part of that, and I love what you said, and this is where I wanted to get Oskar's take on this too, is you can throw tech at a problem like measurement, but you still actually have to hold the human beings accountable to the metrics that tech actually measures. And I know, Oskar, you're doing a ton of work in this space. What do you think?
Yeah. So there are a few things happening. Number one is this problem is not a problem that, came up yesterday. We actually been dealing with it for the last 10 years. If you think about it as, Reckitt, Kimberly Clark, Procter & Gamble really start getting into e-commerce about 2010, right? And there was always the discussion about marketing technology and where it should sit. So I think, from that perspective, there are a few things going on. We are, as an industry, not really measuring what do we know and what do we need to learn next. So like we're doing really crappy at that. And the other problem is that because e-commerce has been always the black box, a lot of the people that actually got ahead in e-commerce were basically very good at telling the story. But it was a little bit of like a Wizard of Oz situation where people really knew how to tell the story about this unknown phenomena of e-commerce. It was like basically a priest, trying to explain the eclipse of the sun, right? And because of that, we basically were very good, and we actually were training to promote the leaders that were really good at telling that story, but without really sharing that knowledge and kind of making sure that everybody can be that priest, that basically can actually explain the eclipse. So we lost this, and a lot of the times, it was very easy to say, it's like, hey, let's launch something new. Let's launch some new tech. And, it's the algorithm that is giving me the answer, right? Without getting people to understand in a very simple terms what it really means, what we are actually trying to solve. So that's why, that our obsessions on actually social media, if you actually look at LinkedIn, became kind of like fundamental, where people started to call themselves future CEOs, the visionary leaders of e-commerce, right? But without actually collectively trying to lift everybody to actually extend that knowledge within the organization. And what is the number one problem that CPGs have? Silos. It was a problem 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, still a problem, right? Because those silos we were not able to breach to actually democratize that knowledge as much as possible.
Yeah, I was thinking, even Chris, when you're talking about jumping over the fence, do you remember like in the movie like Moneyball with Billy Beane, and at the end they're asking him, like, now everybody thinks it's easy, right? And he's like, yeah, everybody thinks it's easy because I ran up against a brick wall so many times, I'm battered and bruised and bloody, and finally I broke through. But now the wall's down and everybody floods through afterwards, right? It's kind of like what you're talking about. Like she was like, it's not really, there is another side. It's this artificial fence that we put up in front of us. But I mean, tying to kind of what Oskar's saying as well, is like, but how do you educate upwards within when we still have a ton of executive teams that, they're just not e-com savvy, right? I mean, there are a ton out there. I don't want to belittle that, but there's the majority of them still, they just didn't, have the core part of their career over the past 10 years in the digital age where people are trying to figure it out and scramble. And it's 100% different. So you have these teams that are tasked with hitting numbers, tasked with measurement, tasked with telling the story, but also tasked with educating upwards. And that is just exhausting and time consuming.
It is. And Aaron, to your point, and there's no silver bullet by any means. I mean, if we had that, we wouldn't.
I tell everybody the only silver bullet is hard work. There's only silver bullet.
Exactly. And humble hard work, right? Too. I mean, like you should always take a moment to be, if you get praise or gratitude for what you do, take a moment to celebrate the team and all the effort, but don't let that go to your head, because there's a reason that we call ourselves first movers. All of us are first movers in whatever that area of change has been and as it has evolved. But to your point, one of the things we realized is there was, and it's not perfectly mature yet, obviously, both in what data is available, but how you measure the success and incrementality of e-com or retail media investment. But there is a way to measure arguably performance in e-commerce and to assess one's digital shelf or one's sales and share at key accounts, or with panel data at a broader level. But what wasn't available necessarily was almost a rubric or a scorecard for how do I qualitatively and quantitatively set myself up for that change that I'm trying to drive the actual sales in. And that's where we tried to put together, again, and I say we borrowed with pride different elements. I mean, we didn't make any of this up as much as just bringing the story to the forefront. But those 8 factors of change, we've actually done several assessments, both, again, how does the executive team assess the organization against the 8 factors of change versus the actual change leaders? Oh, wow, look at these gaps. Why is that? Some of it's qualitative, like, oh, we thought we committed to, like, executive commitment is a big part of it. Some executives say, oh, yeah, we're committed. Well, yeah, the president of the company is committed, but the BU presidents on 3 of the divisions are not committed. So you're not really committed yet. We actually need to go down and score everyone to the best of our ability so we can really see, like, and what does commitment mean, right? It's publicly stating it. It's making that part of the metrics, right? It's making decisions that show that you favored that initiative, whatever they may be. So that's why when you talk about, like, what can I educate upward with that they might pay attention to, since they never did in their own roles in the past, actual e-com, they did traditional retail. It's give them a real tangible formula for success that with some tenets for how to actually measure that. And then you can actually go and spot pick, oh, we're doing everything but resourcing. Like, we don't have enough headcount. We don't have enough dollars. Clearly, we need to evaluate that and figure that out. And so it's not a silver bullet, but it provides a scorecard for enablement, not just performance, the enablement of the performance, if that makes sense.
All right. What I can do is I can give you a little bit of a small silver bullet, right?
Ooh.
So there are a few things that are
Everybody
happening.
leans in.
Yeah.
It's not. It's actually quite simple. Number one is, a lot of the times what people miss about e-commerce is that it's all about shortening the time between desire and delight. It's a gigantic convenience play. It's very simple, right? We are just trying to take friction out of people's life, right? And make them, their process of, discovering new products much more simpler, ability to buy, etc. It's not any different. When I was a kid growing up, in Poland, it was actually end of communism. I'm going to date myself a little bit. But we had those catalogs, where you could actually see computers, Sony TVs, etc. And all I wished is like, I could magically, tap on the picture in that printed catalog, and it's, magically the item would, be delivered to me. I did not invent e-commerce. I'm not claiming like Al Gore, but I just had that notion as a consumer, which I didn't even know that what a consumer was, to basically have this ability to magically take that product and get it delivered to me. That's what it was in my head, Should have, of course, invested in Amazon the minute Amazon came out, but that's not the point. The point is that most of the executives and most of the BU leaders, they are basically doing 60, hours a week, 70 hours a week, etc. They are actually not running their own household. They are never shopping online. So the problem that they have is they have basically that perception of e-commerce where they might fundamentally know intellectually what it is, but they don't have the emotional attachment to it that they are actually making purchases. And a lot of the times, how Chris and I try to break it through, where we would take specific president of a BU, or as, commercial leader, and it's like, hey, go with us to be a GoPuff delivery driver, or go with us to be an Amazon delivery driver, right? Just because of have those experiences to understand is why people are, for example, ordering something at 10 p.m. or ordering something at 4 p.m. And because, they might have a kid, and they might be the only parent. And for example, it's just much easier for them to actually order it through e-commerce because they don't have to deal with a crying toddler going to the store. Or they might be elderly. There it's much easier for whoever they caretaker to actually order their items through e-commerce or, through last mile delivery, and basically, having delivery, to them in a consistent manner. And that's the whole thing is like, the executives a lot of the times don't have that emotional attachment. Like, we are winning minds with them, but no, we are not winning hearts with them. And a lot of it is because a lot of them are, 40s, 50s, and not shoppers on everyday basis, right? Because just they don't have the time. And because of that, it's hard for them sometimes to go, full into e-commerce. Where I do worry about us as an industry is where the future comes in, because you not only have to be e-commerce digitally savvy, there's going to be a huge component of technology. And we're already seeing what has happened, for example, with the influence of ChatGPT, for example, on kids, school kids, where they're using ChatGPT to basically write their essays and then run it against, plagiarism, right? But the same ChatGPT, if it's integrated, for example, with text to shop, could be a great recommendation engine. And how do I explain to an executive ChatGPT, text to shop, and its influence on shopping behavior, right?
When they don't yet know just the traditional e-com transactional journey outside of a few one-off things. And it goes back to your point, Oskar, too, is there, to be fair, whether they did it themselves or not, there was a history of going in store and walking the traditional shelf. And that was how they grew up, going to the store when they did do their own shopping in many cases. I'm not saying they don't all do their own shopping, but how do you get them like real experiences and get them hands-on, even simple, walk the digital shelf, look for somebody doing this really well. Who shows up? Why do you think they show up that way? It sounds so elementary, but those are like the core principles that they need to relearn in this new space. So to your point, Aaron, there's no silver bullet, but that was definitely a smaller silver bullet, is get them immersed in the experience they don't have as a shopper or consumer themselves.
Yeah, I guess, but then also let them know that 3-4 months from now, it's going to be out of date.
Oh,
right?
exactly.
I think about the digital shelf, right? Explaining this to executives, and they'll just type something in, not realizing that if we all three type in the same search, right, a different product could show up, a different recommendation engine. And then if I add another word or 2 words or 3 words to the search, everything goes crazy. So there's not like one digital shelf. There's one digital shelf per person per search term. And now you can put them into cohorts, right? Like if we're close enough with same age, same shopping habits, kids about the same age, then it should show up the same. But also based on past search history, I mean, Google's way ahead of everybody on this, right? Everything that we three searches on Google now is considering everything we've ever searched for, which is
right.
It's going like one level deeper. Do you guys actually go into like organizations and have like full blown, because I'm just thinking back, in my Perigo days, that'd be great to have people from outside come in, right? So we'd have, different teams come in, consultants in a way, but hey, this is, a sales consultant, right? That comes in. Hey, this is an HR consultant. We would have, somebody from a big PMO office come in. Are you guys actually going in and immersing and can do like 2-day, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day? I don't know what it is. Are you able to do that? Because I think that's needed across the board.
And Aaron,
because I do a lot of webinars, that we'll do 300 webinars. That doesn't hit the executive team per se. Our dinners might, but still, that's not as immersive as. I'm thinking like next level to help people out.
It's a good question. Oskar and I are like every company is different, and we've had multi-year relationships with a lot of different companies, which is honestly exciting for us because it allows us to relive being an extension of the broader team, but also being able to cross-pollinate and bring ideas from outside the company in consistently. versus just having that first new hire, as Oskar says, that new car smell for a little bit, but then it wears off. But what we have been doing, because we do a lot of training and certification and executive workshops and customer team workshops, we're able to penetrate in from an education perspective, but that also often tees up, education usually identifies areas of strategy or capability or advisory. If Oscar's working on a program, that usually tees up an area that people need to know more about. And so we're starting to have a lot more broad, multifunctional engagements, which are more exciting for us, because then it's not just training for training's sake. It's training because that ties back to the change formula and is actually being adopted and maybe empowered by the executive team. So we can do those. We do those. No one company is doing them all together, which is why in a perfect world, if there was one ring to rule them all, if we want to go Lord of the Rings here, somebody would do all of those things. And whether it was us plus many others, we'd love to be a part of seeing that success formula come to life.
Yeah, because there are a few things that are happening. Number one is, we know as Chris, as myself, that we have to be actually engaged in solving real, world problems, right? Because e-commerce knowledge is not only what we acquired, in the last 10, 15 years, it's also, do we have an ability to learn something new? Because sometimes we might have an answer, but it could be even a better answer, right? And Chris and I are a little bit of some, purists. We love to actually kind of one up, because we have this drive when it comes into education, just especially when it comes into our own education, because we know we can sit stagnant. So a few things are happening. Number one is, we know that if we actually do those programs, we want to kind of position ourselves as a think tank, but also not only for the high ideas, but also kind of like a janitor team on the Death Star, that we can be behind the scene and solve any problem, because we are just creative guys with a creative team, and we actually have a visibility to the entire CPG space and making sure that we can do those tweaks. But to Chris's point, is what a lot of the times is happening is, we have this award-winning recipe for growth, right? That exists. I'm just saying we do, just there's an award-winning recipe. But sometimes not everybody has all the ingredients. Sometimes people don't have the time to actually execute them. Maybe they don't have the right equipment, within their kitchen, or maybe they don't have the right skills, right? So that's why nobody out there is perfect, because they're all dealing with massive teams that, a lot of times, again, are siloed. A lot of the times there's a lot of movement in e-commerce, and we know the e-commerce capability, it's not going up, day after day. It can go up, it can go down. The team leader leaves, might be a gap, somebody else, can take over internally, etc. There are a lot of factors, and I'm sure, Aaron, you run into the same thing.
Well, it's just exactly it. I mean, just thinking, the organizational structure, I get that question answered a lot. And I just, outside of that's why I was asking is, just connecting from that standpoint, with other people in my network, with you guys, is the fact that, that's a multi-day exercise to understand their organizational design. I was like, well, what should the Amazon organization look like? Right. So before it was e-com, and then it was direct to consumer, and then, COVID hit, and it was Amazon and direct to consumer. And now everything's being mashed back together. And it's just all over the place. And I think a lot of it is, you can only bake what you have the ingredients and the equipment to bake. Right. That's kind of what you're saying, Oskar. I completely agree. Is you can't, if you don't have an oven, you're not getting the cake. That's just the reality. So there's fundamental pieces you need. But then if you want to do something crazy, mainly what I'm telling people is that you have to do that deep look into your organization and the processes that you have, the technology you have, the willing to do investment. But the next thing is just to know that 6 months from now it's going to be out of date, that you actually, I encourage everybody, part of this, I'm a scientist, right? Is, you need an R&D budget for e-com, for digital. You need to have something off on the side where people can play around with the newest thing. And if they lose money on it, it doesn't matter. That's pharma OTC, pharma R&D, right? It is, 99 out of 100 experiments don't work, but you get to the one that does, it's worth a lot of money. And so that's kind of where I'm telling people, just remember, sometimes there might be additional things that you need to come across. But if you're not investing, or you're not getting the right person or the right opportunity or if you're punishing for failure, you're never going to get to the other side of the fence.
But that's part of the problem that we're actually seeing, right? If you actually would explain CPGs as a massive rubber band, a lot of those e-commerce leaders are basically trying to push that rubber band left or right as much as possible, right? But eventually it snaps back, right? And a lot of the times those e-commerce leaders are being penalized for thinking too much ahead, for not really thinking about this year. And then the next year rolls in, like, the same thing happened with COVID, where suddenly it's such a big change is that everybody's just trying to, pay catch up. So that's the whole thing is I think fundamentally e-commerce leaders that are really thinking ahead are really struggling with a few things. Number one is how to, not to think too much ahead and still being able to deliver results. Where I think actually 2023 is going to be it's going to be a tough year for most of the CPGs, maybe besides grocery, because grocery has a lot of, fuel in the tank still in terms of, the experiences. That how do we actually kind of make sure that we actually being able to balance this, being able to deliver the results, right? Without kind of, being over, too bullshitting it too much. And how do we actually think about the future? Because e-commerce has been around for, 25 years, technically, right? CPG e-commerce, let's say, almost 15 years. But the problem with it is that what it takes to win today in 2023, it's a lot of nuance and a lot of grind. And if you think about it, is a lot of e-commerce leaders, again, not necessarily very good at operations. And a lot of the times they are very good at telling the story. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that will leave e-commerce in 2023 just because of it's going to be too grind-centric, too scientific. And it's going to be much harder for them to basically accomplish the goals that they are trying to accomplish. And then think about the future, right? With all of the disruption that comes in. So it's going to be very interesting here, the way I see it.
Aaron, to Oscar's point, a quote that sticks out in my mind, and this actually plays into like the two big barriers that I think are holding. There are a lot of barriers that are in front of us, but we like to empower ourselves beyond the barriers, but it's good to call Voldemort by his name. Right. But the barriers in my mind, if somebody said, what's one thing that would solve all of the problems, it would be, and we were talking a little bit about this before joining you today, it's measurement, right? So I don't want to solve all problems with measurement, but if we had the right metrics across all the levels of an organization, all the functions, things actually would start to solve themselves. And the reason being is everyone would be accountable to the same number of degrees away from Kevin Bacon, i.e. the goal that we really want to achieve. And the problem is the silos have occurred over the years for a number of reasons, but they've stayed proverbially more of a problem because most companies hadn't changed their goals or they had too many goals. And so measurement's been a real issue. But then this kind of goes to our point about how do you train executives and this e-commerce leadership generation that's come about. It's what we were calling, it's not measurement, it's measurement. And there's like a couple angles on this weird word we made up, but measurement being, and I don't want anybody to feel offended by this because we all have to stay humble. I think that's the key to your point about in 3 months, everything could be different again. Traditional leaders who were not in e-com denied or kind of avoided e-com up until you couldn't avoid it anymore. And now that it's happening and actually disrupting them, they didn't practice. It's like that Franklin Roosevelt quote, a smooth sea does not make a great sailor, right? So there was a tumultuous sea, but they were staying in the harbor and not going out to sea to actually practice being disrupted, even though they were starting to be disrupted. Now, then those sailing those seas, i.e. the e-com and the digital leaders out there, they were definitely learning how to be a good type of sailor, but they were learning how to manage ambiguity and the future, as Oscar was saying before, telling a really good story, not making up anything, but the point, telling the story that needed to be told to get people to leave the harbor and go take on the sea. The problem is now now we have a different tumultuous sea. It's called maturity and complexity and I can't say that word, operationalizing this space and staying the practitioner and not trying to elevate yourself to thought leader. And I don't mean that we aren't thought leaders because we were first movers, we're all pushing the boundaries, but if you stay a leader practitioner, even if you're enabling a team, you stay close enough to how things are really working and you stay a really great sailor, even if you're the admiral on the ship with a lot of other sailors and, and team members making the ship run. And so I just think there's an ego vanity element, and I don't think people have bad intent. It's just, you are what you measure. And without the right measurement, we end up either avoiding or capitalizing on what isn't maybe being measured effectively. And that ends up being vanity oriented, like I'm going to protect myself or I'm going to inflate myself. And really, we have to come back to that humble point of like, we're all going to be disrupted over the next 2 years by Chat GPT, the metaverse, and social commerce, and all this other stuff emerging. Are you ready for that? Are we ready for that? The three of us? Maybe not. We need to start learning. We need to be humble, go back to the grind wherever we can to make sure we're staying on top of it. So it's really more of that. I think executives too, not that they aren't humble, but take that next step of humility and go immerse yourself. Find a way as an executive to go immerse yourself. Don't wait for it to come to you. Go get yourself in the deep water, if that makes sense.
I do think I like the analogy because over the pandemic, especially when it kicked off. So you think about where we sat up into that point where we're out there on the rough seas, really rough, right? Like nobody sailed these seas before. And we're figuring it all out. And yeah, a lot of teams are sitting in the back, like the traditional teams are sitting, sales teams. Oh, e-commerce is just a fad. It might happen. It might not. It's never going to, be that big. It's going to be a rounding error. And then all of a sudden COVID hits and a lot of people get thrust into it, but it's easy sailing. Everybody's up. And so we had a lot of people over the course of 2 years who didn't really understand digital, but it didn't matter how much they did wrong, right? It was just growing. Right. You didn't matter if you have website latency. It didn't matter if the detail page, if they wanted the product and they're going to Amazon, they're going to order it and you're going to be up in digital year over year. And so it's just like this false sense of capability around what's going on. And then there's two things that happen, right? All of a sudden it starts getting hard and you have people who are humble and are realizing kind of what you're saying. Oh, wow, I've got a ton to learn. You got a bunch of people that sailed the original rough seas and now they're back. This actually feels normal. Like, yeah, it's tough to get traffic. It's tough to handle conversion. It's tough to, get the right content. And then you've got some people out there that are like really, really struggling because they don't realize how easy they had it. And fundamentally, I mean, at the same time, the pendulum's swinging to people going back to in store and they're like, awesome, I'm going back in store.
Yeah, I told you it was never going to take off.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, that's what I always said.
I always love it when they're like, look, it's softening. And you're like, and I say this every time just because a very thoughtful finance analyst schooled me on this early in my career, but it was like, yeah, it's softening because the base got bigger. So I'm sorry, the percent can't just keep being the same or higher percent over and over again because the base got bigger. But yes, it is softening, but not because it's not important. It's because of inflation and people weighing the cost of things, which is then causing retailers to figure out innovative ways to re-engage people to come back in so that they can win with the path of least resistance in e-commerce. So with memberships and other offers. So there's just a real, I using the word humility both offends and seems often, I generally would say humility offends people who are both either really humble or who think that they're humble but aren't. And then but it also feels like a throwaway word. Well, yeah, everybody's humble. No, it's not just the people who are self-promoting that aren't humble. It's just everybody needs to go about like, how do I actually act on the reality that I know that I don't know everything? Everyone can say that. Most people say, oh, I don't know everything. Good. Or what are you doing about it? Like, I would say there's passive humility and active humility. Passive humility is I truly believe I could learn more. Active humility is I went to do it because technically it's my responsibility as a leader to my team, my company, all the stakeholders in the industry to go learn this so that I can contribute to a future where we don't die and one where we actually not just survive, but thrive. I think I have a lot of passion around that because maybe this sounds overly altruistic.
I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell at all.
Oscar and I have talked about this, like, what is our mission as a company? And it's not to make it like, for all your wildest dreams to come true or whatever. Like, but it is like, if we don't do what we're all doing, like companies go out of business. And what happens when they go out of business? Will somebody else replace them? Sure. But will those people's livelihoods and all the great impact that hopefully their brands were like, there's so much that gets lost from maybe unintentional mismanagement that's driven by a lack of humility and ultimately a lack of accountability, which comes from that measurement, which may be tech enabled and whatnot. So there's a lot of like root causes here that can be solved for.
But some of it is also that we are just scratching what is possible, right? Think about it as if we live in a world with a Tesla bot actually being useful, right? If we live in a world where Chat GPT becomes, your personal assistant, that it's building your digital DNA and giving you all the right recommendations, and you basically can finally realize the dream of having your optimized budget for the year of things you need to buy, things you want to eat, discover a new recipe. It can make it so much easier, right? In terms of, how your life operates. And some of the people will love it. Some of the people say, well, this is too much, for my life. But a lot of people will basically embrace it because it will just free up their time to spend more time with families versus just like doing another a chart that they need to do, right? And the worst that can happen is like, oh my God, on my personal task list, I have 10 things to do. And those 10 things could be done, by technology or some kind of AI, right? And the challenge that we basically have is like that people just don't even see it, that this is possible. Because if you look at even, the readership of, science fiction books or science fiction movie, it's very low. And, the way I actually look at it is we are just scratching the surface, how these things can progress and, solving different problems that we might have in the future. And, for me, what was fascinating, going back to that Chat GTP, that I think that was the first time when a technology spread amongst all the high schoolers across the globe through TikTok in probably less than 24 hours.
Right. It spread faster than TikTok spread.
Exactly.
Because of TikTok.
Because of TikTok. So think about it, is there's like an inflection of social media, of mobile, of 5G, of ultra connectivity, and being able to translate any content to any language. And basically kids figure out it's like, hell, I don't have to be writing all my essays, right? All I got to do is just get ChatGPT to write something, run it through plagiarism, and I'm good. And suddenly the teachers are seeing that their kids are basically become from poor writers, fantastic writers, right? But they cannot do anything.
Genius, finally.
Geniuses, right? So that's the whole thing, is like, that generation can adapt to change so quick. So if you basically start using like a text to chat functionality with some sort of AI that start getting information about you and giving you all the relevant product recommendations, you become dependent on it just because it knows you so well. I mean, who in the right mind would step out and say, you know what, I'm going to regress and do something I did 5 years ago when I had to do the research. I didn't know what I wanted. I was very frustrated because I couldn't find the right product. Because, going back to Amazon, Jeff Bezos missed one huge cue about e-commerce, which kind of messed things up for a lot of us, which is he basically created a store of everything. And he missed the revolution that he should be creating the store of you or the store of me. So provide me with relevant recommendations, with relevant products, with relevant selections, and not being bombarded by 1,000 options for the same product that I need. And I'm basically overwhelmed with choices that I have, right? And I think there's going to be a time where we're going to rely on AI to actually undo some of the wrongdoings that we did, which saying is like, it's okay to have billions of SKUs. Really? Who needs it? If I need probably 1,000 items in my life at a given point, and that means I have to basically do a massive research, right? And I don't trust the reviews because, they might be self-generated or paid reviews, etc., right? So that's kind of, it's getting interesting is where the future can actually go, to what directions, and how we can basically, we'll have to adapt to it, and how we're going to actually be, be dependent on the technologies that we're going to be actually seeing.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody, very few people realize how fast it's changing at this point in time, and accelerated by COVID because so much money was dumped, right? And there's free flowing money everywhere into the tech space. And if you look back even 2 years, the AI is not there to power a lot of the recommendation engines, the CDPs, whatever it might be. It wasn't there. It's there now, right? And that only means it's going to accelerate faster and faster and faster. And that, I think, is disturbing for a lot of people from the standpoint of there's always a new normal, but that means there's always a new normal. Like, we're not getting back to normal, and we're never going to stay for a decade like we have in the past. Every year it's going to be a new normal. And yeah, exciting,
which is
depressing
scary.
at the same time. I don't know.
It's scary, but it's also, and this is a good example. So my wife is in education, and obviously they have been impacted in literally the last week by this Chat GPT, and there's a lot of concern about how do you manage this? How do you protect against this? What's the future of learning? I mean, and these are real. I mean, there's a whole lot of implications for marketing and sales and everything we're doing too with artificial intelligence driven everything. But my point to her was not, acknowledge your, the emotion that's real, right? The fear, the uncertainty, the anxiety, also some excitement around what it could be. But yet it's not that you have to know what the path forward is. Just know that you bounced back from disruption before. Now, the problem is we're probably gonna have, it's like that Rocky Balboa quote from the Sixth movie, if you're nerdy enough to have watched all of them. But it's not about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you get hit and keep moving forward. And it's true. So it's not, I don't know where I'm moving forward to yet perfectly. I just know that when I've gotten knocked down, I bounced back because I went to seek the information that, and this might be more of a personal measurement. Like, how do I, again, going back to measurement, how do I measure myself to future-proof myself so that irrespective of whether my company does what they need to do or not, I hope they do, and I hope I can help them do that. But if they can't, I'm not wed to them. I need to make sure I put my own mask on first, and my family's and anybody that I support, by seeking the knowledge and the roles and responsibilities and wherever I can serve that will keep me making an income, but and a livelihood, but can go and help the right companies, the ones who are willing to change. And so that's there's an excitement here. If you remember that you can bounce back from this every time, which most of us have, whether we realized it or not, then I don't need to worry about I can't control where we go next exactly. I just need to prep for the skills that'll enable me to go next, if that makes sense. It's like a stoic approach. I haven't mastered it yet. Oskar can confirm.
You got to look from a bright side, though. If we create AI models to truly understand how Aaron or Chris, or myself think, as for every single individual, right? We could actually acquire more knowledge, because things that would not be accessible to us because the way they are taught is not on the same wavelength, or, we are not vibing the same way, as my son would say, right? It suddenly can be actually accessible. Like, for me, the most exciting thing is, you can take any topic, like, let's say, you can take, quantum mechanics, and you can write to the quantum mechanics and explain it for a 5-year-old, and it, AI will spit out for you. But you could do the same thing, is like, hey, if there is a digital footprint and a digital kind of like a DNA, the way we all collectively think, it could actually adjust the explanation of this idea to all of us. And all of us are not thinking the same way, not learning the same way, right? Because the good example is, let's say, if you have a class of, fifth graders, and there is 30 of them, probably 3 or 4 out of them will fry, because they are basically on the same wavelength that the teacher is, and they have this aptitude. But majority of the kids out there, will have, maybe some learning disabilities, maybe we're not fully engaged, maybe just, a more visual versus, learning from from a lecture of a student, maybe they need like a hands-on, right? So there are different ways of learning. And the technology can enable to translate these concepts to our level, our wavelength. And I honestly think that's going to be fascinating, because suddenly things that will not be accessible to us normally, because it would take too much mental energy, right? And it's really hard. They can be actually simplified to us, basically for us to understand what it is. So on that level, I can explain any technical concept to Chris and suddenly he gets it,
and it would be, and arguably it would be maybe proactively brought to me through the formats that I best learn against, right? Because that's one of the issues too. We do training for different companies, and yes, we do best practices and measure ourselves on making sure we're doing a good job. But every single one of the thousands of learners or hundreds of learners in each group may be learning a very different way, coming from a very different place. And not because they're not smart. Some might need a little bit more of a hand holding through new terms, whereas others know the terms, they don't get the principles. And so what if the same program could almost auto personalize to every single person through a longer term or an immersive experience? And that's what's, I mean, those are just some of many ways that obviously this could be quite empowering. I just saw somebody on LinkedIn today said, AI won't take your job. People who can use AI will. And that's, to be fair, that's true, right? People who can use the tech are going to be in a better place. And you might say, well, I don't even know where to start with what tech I need. Well, that's okay. Ask around, start reading, like I said, everything you'd ever want to know in the world is literally sitting in Google, if not also on ChatGPT. Ask the question, right? That's the problem. Is I can know everything I want, but I didn't care to ask. So I didn't get the answer, right? So it's just, it's that curiosity, right? And I think what Jim Collins in Good to Great always said, it's the productive paranoia, right? Have that for yourself, not just for a company. And you will very unlikely stumble so far off the beaten path that you never come back. You will actually have created a beaten path and be the first mover in your space that has a job and is empowering others to move into that next space too.
Yeah, I mean, the only wrong thing to do is to do nothing.
Right.
So I've been picking your brains. Any questions? We kind of get to the end here. Any questions you have for me? As I spent the last 45 minutes or so just picking your brains.
Yeah. No, well, I know you are honestly. We'll come up with a sexier title, and you might already have King of the Andals and the First Men. You may have a couple, but honestly, I feel like out of all people, we all want to be connectors, but you're like the great connector. We'll come up with a cooler, like Terminator style name for that, or an Avenger level name, but like honestly, because you're at the crossroads of all the number of calls you take, the number of dinners you have and conversations, makes what we do look very, very small, even though you're doing this all the time. What are the biggest pain points you're seeing? Because I'm sure they're not dissimilar, but they might be even more accentuated in a specific area.
The biggest pain points right now is people are finally coming to the grips with the fact that they have no idea what's going to happen. And you're usually people are fine with that if they can say, as the pandemic kicked off or the year after pandemic. But as the pendulum swings back a little bit to more of that balance between offline and online, people they're trying to figure out a couple things. What do I do next? Who do I do it? And what are the tools I use? And knowing that it's all going to change next year. And again, like I was saying, there's no new normal. That's kind of why I brought it up, is that's at the forefront of everything. And so as they're defining their years, they're trying to go through and first rationalize through their tech stack, right? That's whoever their vendors are. I should say their vendor, not necessarily their tech stack. Direct to consumer, Amazon, Walmart. Who do I need? And who do I just log into once a month and I don't need anymore? How do I rationalize that? The next phase of that is, how do I get all the right people, right, in the right seats on the bus? But also, how do I interconnect? They have, 25 to 75 different vendors. Is there a way to get all of those guys to talk together? So if I were to say, if I were to kind of like thinking through this out loud,
it's okay.
People are trying to take a higher level view of e-commerce, digital commerce as a whole, and now they actually have the time. And the people who are going to win are kind of those, I think, the people that were out on the rough seas early on, or the people who got thrust into it and just love the idea of change and lifelong learning. And they're the ones, as we see different brands, unfortunately, if you were just direct to consumer and you're really struggling right now, maybe they'll fade away as less money is flowing into tech investments right now. And you'll see a lot of like, the new tech that was popping up. Maybe there was 185 CDPs. We're going to end the year with 30, right? Because that money will dry up. So holistically being able to align a strategy, the balance between, e-commerce and in-store, the right people in the right seats on the bus, the right tech, and who's going to survive. And, at any point in time, they can control one of those and they can focus on one of those. And so that's where it's just an uneasiness, if I had to say anything. A lot of people sitting on a ton of inventory. Amazon really did a number on people reducing the weeks of cover they're going to carry. That has people dialing back paid media, because if you only have 2.3 weeks of inventory at Amazon, you're dialing back your paid media on Amazon.
You can't afford to over promote because you'll run out. So
right. How do you find a 3PL? Right? One of these digital age 3PLs. I've done a couple of these with Corey over at DaVinci Micro Fulfillment as backup to Amazon or drop shipping. You have to figure that out because stores will reduce inventory at this point in time. You just can't go out of stock. So how do you find that balance? And the other side is just, what do they do with all the data? Right? What do you do with all the data? And you talk about, the measurement. But a lot of stuff that people look at, the data that you get out is based on the research you do. And I did some really cool work with IDEO, design group out of Chicago, in my early ecom days. And they came, I just remember talking to them about me search, and don't dive into me search, dive into research, because me search is you focused and what you expect the outcomes to be. And so, there's a lot of that at executive levels right now within digital, the CDOs, that I think me search is going on, and that's slowly going to change. It's going to have to. So kind of a long-winded answer, a lot of complicated stuff going on, but yeah, I'm addicted to people. That's what I am. I love e-commerce and I absolutely love people, and yeah, can't get enough of it.
Your me search comment makes me think of a magic 8-ball where it's like, will e-commerce grow really well this year? No. Oh, shake it again.
Yeah. Right.
Looks like yes.
You get the answer you got, and then you just keep recording it until you get the one you wanted.
Exactly. Of course it will. Okay, awesome. Oskar, to your point about all that data, I mean, you're helping a number of people sort through that that dog pile of data, but yet, and everybody's focused on data, but what data actually matters and how do you make use of it? How are you tackling that?
I mean, the biggest challenge that we have is that, number one, is if you actually look at any organization that has multiple data sources, across the globe, nothing is synced up, right? Because of KPIs, measurements. It's definitely hard to actually tell a cohesive story. And the challenge, what it is that a lot of those organizations that basically want to hear good news. So people are uncomfortable with red, they're uncomfortable with yellow. They want to make every scorecard to look the perfect as possible. If the scorecard is red, it means it's too hard. It's if it's too hard for one country, then they're going to change it for another country, right? So suddenly you will have completely different set of rules for Brazil, for Mexico, for US, for Germany, for France. It happens everywhere. And I had a lot of those conversations with a lot of the executives when I basically said, it's like, I'd rather have a unified scorecard which tells even bad stories with some commentary why we are okay with the bad story for right now, because somebody else going to take the blueprint or the scorecards and miss huge opportunity because everything was embellished, right? And from that perspective, I'm okay with change. And if you actually look at the KPIs, especially on content, oh my God, I mean, the content KPIs can balloon to almost historical amount, just because of you can look at retailer scorecard, you can look at competitors, you can look at best practices, you can look at content distribution, and suddenly every single subcomponent is only worth 1%, and you miss some of those big stories. So I do think when it comes into data, that what's going to be critical, it's communication, storytelling, being okay with the bad story. But also what's really super important is being also okay with having to explain some of the decisions and treating it as there could be a completely new team starting from ground up tomorrow, and being okay with it. Because for me, it's much better to have a chart that it's accurate versus a chart if I was, Christopher Columbus and basically say I end up in India and that's it, right? There is no America. There's just India there.
Right. The logical conclusion then, right, is there's no America.
Yeah.
Right.
Or somebody kind of, basically getting to Antarctica and basically say there's a Great Wall there and that's it. Maps don't change. Over time, we're going to get better and better in terms of being able to build better maps, better dashboard, but let them be accurate dashboard. Let's move past this being a good news company, which a lot of the companies just love green scorecards, because what's going to happen if we accomplishing all green? That basically will mean that people, resources will basically divert it to something else that is red, but it's not going to be a reflection of the reality where the reality is. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have is within e-commerce and data and KPIs is that we are just thinking about this as a 6 months exercise to get it from red to green, and then we are done. And that's where the space moves in. KPIs need to be adjusted, and those scorecards no longer reflect the reality on the market. And, the revenue suffers, consumer behavior suffers.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. So we're pretty much right at time here. Oskar, Chris, thanks so much for your time today. You guys are doing awesome stuff in this space. If anybody wants to reach out to them, it's firstmovr, firstmovr. They're just
no E in e-commerce. That's why we dropped the E from firstmovr.
Oh, nice. I didn't know that. That's cool.
It's just commerce, but there was a silent E for a while. So we recognize that.
You guys are doing awesome stuff. Really appreciate everything you're doing to educate brands in the space. And you guys are great friends, partners, supporters, and network. So really appreciate that. With that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Digital Deep Dive. Thanks everybody for tuning in. All righty. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Oskar. We'll see you.
Thank you.